Welcome to today's episode of Very Able, where we explore variability to empower extraordinary. In classrooms across the country, educators are recognizing something that occupational therapists have long understood, that every student's brain and body develop uniquely, creating incredible variability in how we learn, move, and engage with the world around us. Our guest today is Cindy Letso, an occupational therapist at Appalachia IU8 with 24 years of experience supporting students with diverse learning needs. She'll guide us in understanding how fine motor skills, handwriting abilities, sensory processing, and physical development fundamentally shape a student's educational experience. Whether you're a teacher wondering why some students struggle with a pencil grip, a parent curious about sensory sensitivities, or an administrator looking to make your school more inclusive, today's conversation will provide practical insights into creating learning environments where all students can thrive.
Welcome to Very Able, the story of variability, the podcast where we explore the wonderful world of education and delve into the power of honoring learning variability and understanding that all kids are very able. Your hosts, Brianne and Andrea, two educational consultants with IU8, will navigate the ever-changing landscape of instructional practices and share strategies, insights, and inspiring stories that will empower you to create truly inclusive learning environments in order to unlock the full potential of every student and to create transformative educational experiences for all. Come along as we explore variability to empower extraordinary.
Hey, Cindy, thanks so much for joining us today to explore occupational therapy and the world of education and OT. How are you today?
I'm fine. I'm great. Thanks for having me today. I'm excited to talk about this topic today.
Yeah, absolutely. Cindy, you and I have worked together in the past in my work as an SLP, in work on our Brain Steps team, which we just highlighted recently with a podcast with Dr. Madera. So you also provide support to our Brain Steps team. We've done some evaluations together, so it's really great to be here. Could you just start with a little introduction of yourself so that our viewers know and our listeners know a little bit more about you?
Sure. As you stated before, I've been an occupational therapist with IU8 now for 24 years. So I've been working in pediatrics for a long time, and I've seen a lot of changes, and I've learned a lot over the years. And prior to that, I worked in a hospital for 6 years. So over my 24 years here, I've been on the autism assessment team, on the Brain Steps team, and the feeding team. And I think that a lot of that has helped me to provide, service to all my students in the best way that I can and help ensure their learning success.
Now, you said how many years you've had here. I'm sure you've seen lots of things change over time. The one question that is burning in my mind is what are you noticing in the classroom these days that are higher needs for our students that may not have been an issue just a few years ago?
I'm seeing a lot of sensory needs for our students, a lot of difficulties with handwriting, attention, those types of things. It seems to be the consensus that, and behaviors, but behaviors can be related to a lot of those things I just mentioned. And that seems to be the consensus that I am getting from a lot of the teachers in the classroom. And it just it's been evolving over the past several years, and it seems to be more evident now.
Can you share a little bit how that will impact a child's learning experience and what you do to help with those things?
Sure. Well, I think one of the biggest ones is attention. If a child can't attend and they're constantly moving, they're obviously not going to be hearing what the teacher is saying. They're not going to be picking up on social cues from their classmates and or their teacher, and they're just not going to be able to learn. So to me, attention is a very big one and something that everybody needs to be working on. If the person is having sensory processing difficulties, that again can't sit still, or they're having sensitivity to light, sensitivity to noises in the room or textures, things of that nature, then again, they're not going to be able to organize themselves enough to be able to sit and learn to process the information that's being presented to them, whether it be through, a computer or a book, hearing the teacher speak. So if they're having difficulties with any of those sensory systems, then that's obviously going to affect their ability to learn. Difficulty with handwriting in the classroom, that can really affect a student because if they can't write properly, legibly, then they're not going to be able to read their writing in order to study for tests. Their answers are going to be marked wrong because they aren't able to, the teacher isn't able to read them. They're not going to be able to effectively communicate with even their peers if they can't write and even display their work socially. That's going to affect them. So there's lots of those things that really affect the learning environment that I'm seeing.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and I think that those lead to bigger issues where that works on a child's self-esteem. It really increases their anxiety. And then you see children really shutting down, which is very difficult to watch. And we want to try to get these kids back to where they feel successful again so that they can have a positive learning environment.
Yeah. And you mentioned behavior, Cindy, sometimes being secondary to some of these issues. And I think Brianna and I have also heard that sensory processing difficulties is it's coming around. We're getting a lot of questions about that. Could you provide, some ideas or some signs that teachers, parents, educators should be looking for that might indicate a student is experiencing some sensory processing challenges?
Sure. For one thing, lots of times, again, you will see that a child has difficulty sitting still. They may be standing at their seat a lot, moving around. You may see them, we all know classrooms can get loud, but you may see children covering their ears. They may have difficulty sensitivity to light where they're covering their eyes or, really looking around a lot and they just can't focus visually. You'll have just children acting out, too much stimuli in the classroom. And sometimes these children don't know where their body is at in space, so they may look really clumsy and just have really poor coordination. So that will, again, affect their ability to sit there and learn. And if they can't regulate their body or pressure, then they're knocking into their classmates. They're breaking their pencil tips. They coloring really hard with a crayon. All those types of things are things that you can look for, or kids just even shutting down. Looking for that in a classroom is really critical of noticing that with a child. And usually, most of the time you can notice that in a student right away, but there are some kids that it is very subtle, where they're maybe a little bit more quiet and it's maybe not as noticeable, but you have to really look for those signs. And they just may be more subtle in some children.
So what are some simple sensory tools or strategies that you could share for teachers to implement in a general education classroom or for parents to try at home?
Sure. Some things that you can try, for one big thing that I know a lot of students complain about is the fluorescent lighting. So sometimes, teachers will put covers over some of the lights so that really dims the fluorescent lighting. So that helps with some students. Given a child, if you see that they're having difficulty with too much stimulation covering their ears, if you could give them some noise reduction headphones or just trying to keep the classroom a little bit more quiet. Incorporating physical breaks throughout the day, like starting off the day with some movement and giving several breaks throughout the day to help them be able to attend more, to be able to give their bodies a break. Also, I think just using some strategies like with vision, keeping your classrooms a little bit more plain, like not, you want to have obviously a nice stimulating classroom, but you don't want to have too many things hanging from the tops of your ceilings and it's just too much visual distraction with kids. So that's another thing, using different tools like different colors whenever you're writing on the smart board. And, there's all kinds of things that can just modify an environment to make it a more soft learning environment and just without clutter.
Yeah. That's a great point. I'm so glad you mentioned that, Cindy, because sometimes Brianna and I will say, well, let's maybe think about strategically putting up visual supports in the classroom because we know visual supports are important, but we also know that if there's too many visual supports or too many visual distractions, we really then compete for our students'
Absolutely.
attention. Sometimes we, with all best intentions, all of those things on Teachers Pay Teachers that we can put up, or all those colorful backgrounds. But yeah, I appreciate you bringing that
Mhm.
point up as well, because we really can. And we can link it in the show notes again, though. Brianna and I did an environmental kind of assessment, and how can we really design environments that are appropriate sensory spaces, that are welcoming to all students. So we
Yes.
can relink that as well.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, going back to some of the struggles that you mentioned at the beginning of the episode that you're seeing now. I also work in the MTSS world, so we do a lot of literacy, and I get a lot of questions about the importance of handwriting, and kids are typing these days, and um, does it really matter if they write? So what are some challenges you're seeing in today's world where kids aren't really picking up pencils or crayons as much because, we do have screen time and iPads. Um, what is some feedback you could give to educators to encourage handwriting? And if a child needs alternatives for handwriting, what are some of those tools that they could use?
I'm glad you brought that up because I have had occasionally where some teachers or administrators have said to me, like, is handwriting really that important anymore because of the digital age? And my answer is always a resounding yes.
Same.
It's just there is that motor brain connection. There's a lot of studies out there that say, when you are writing, that is part of learning, and that motor brain connection is critical in helping students to learn. And to me, that also translates to reading. It translates to so many other areas in education that to me that it's still very important. Now, is it's can't always be the only option because we do have some children that really, no matter what we do to try to remediate their writing, that they really struggle. And it gets to a point where, I always still try to remediate first with handwriting. And, we'll use tools such as adaptive highlighted paper that again helps visually show them where to place letters, helps them learn with, sizing, spacing, and correct formation, line placement, those types of things that are really critical to making printing legible. Um, I will also incorporate visual strategies, like whenever somebody's trying to copy from a smartboard or anything, if a child is having difficulty with their vision going from a vertical plane to a horizontal plane, maybe them having a slant board so that their eyes aren't having to move as much. Because we are seeing a lot of children with more visual deficits than we ever
Mm-hmm.
had before. And I think that some of that is um, stemming from kids skipping developmental milestones, even not crawling as much or not interacting with more physical items rather than just looking at screens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and honestly, to me, I still want kids to engage physically because I feel like when they're coming to me for therapy, they're already getting enough screen time. So to me, that old-fashioned way is still one of my most primary ways to, engage them. And you want to be hitting all the sensory systems, again, with the motor, the touch, the feeling, hearing, learning, all those sensory systems, because that's what's going to, again, help the child learn best. Um, there's also using highlighters to show kids where to write. If they need more space, providing them with an extra sheet of paper, because if a child's writing largely and they're trying to fit something in on a worksheet, give them, line paper, not always necessarily
Mm-hmm.
giving kids just a blank sheet of paper. Those are some simple strategies that every teacher can put into a room to help make handwriting better. Um, and I believe that I think that at least basics these kids need to learn. Like I always still think it's important for somebody to be able to sign their name in cursive, but cursive, that's a whole nother story in today's, whether that's important or not. And I have my opinions on that as well. But
Mm-hmm.
I still think that kids do need to at least be able to print some, and then they can supplement with technology as needed. But I always try to remediate first. Then if I see that a child is shutting down or they're still continuing to have difficulty despite what their needs are in the classroom, then there's times where I try to do both, where maybe they print just any like short answers, maybe their spelling test or just on a sheet of paper if they just need one word answers or a simple sentence, then I encourage the teachers to still encourage them to write that way. But if it's a longer an essay or a report, then let them obviously keyboard that or type it. And then if keyboarding is also difficult, which I do see that with a lot of kids, because again, it's another brain to motor connection. There's always, talk to text. There's other apps out there that your assistive tech people can certainly advise you on for kids like SnapType and ModMath, those types of, interventions that can help to a child along, like I said, a very collaborative approach, a multifaceted one. I don't think that there's just one thing versus another. I like to see them using all kinds of modes so that they have that available to them.
Yeah.
And we know we have that Andrea Zern here, who's our
Yes.
assistive tech lady. She's
Yes.
it.
There's a
amazing.
wealth of resources for us
That's
for
it.
that stuff.
Absolutely.
And I just love though, Cindy, the way that you worded that we aren't going to just replace handwriting, right? And I hear that a lot when I have my
Yes.
assistive technology hat on, because if we're providing some support for reading, where we're taking that text and making it into an audible measure, well, they're not going to learn how to read. Well, but we still need to balance
Yes.
access to the curriculum and access to the content in a way that they can understand, while still providing that instruction and that intervention to make sure that we're increasing and improving literacy and handwriting skills. So I love how you worded that, because you're spot on. We need to continue to work toward those goals, and really think about which ways are going to benefit, which sounds like a framework to me, Brianne. Maybe that universal design for learning framework that I don't know, can't move off of it. Firm goals, flexible means, where we know what we want our students to learn and be able to do, but then we're providing some pathways. Maybe, I don't know if you see sometimes, Cindy, like maybe fatigue, like if students fatigue throughout the day, so their handwriting is really great in the morning and
Yes.
they're going to choose to handwrite, but then maybe at the end of the day, they're not. So they need some options to say like, hey, yeah, handwrite a little bit, and then I'm going to use my speech to text, or I'll, keyboard a little bit. But having those flexible pathways, I think, is really important. And I see that a little bit in my AT lens, students with maybe cerebral palsy or some forms of muscular dystrophy, where they're starting out really solid and their handwriting looks great in the morning, but then the afternoon, like you would think that'd be handwriting from a completely different student. So
Absolutely.
having those
Absolutely.
pathways is super important.
Yes.
You had mentioned about developmental milestones.
Mhm.
Is there anything that you could share that are related to fine motor skills for our educators to be aware of, that if they do have students who may not be hitting those milestones, like what's some advice you can give to them?
Sure. Just for a little background, real quickly, a lot of people don't realize, though, that development, just when you're starting from a child as a baby, that obviously gross motor muscles, your large group muscles, develop first. And so you're looking at your core strength, they get your shoulders, your hips, those, all those muscle groups are the ones to develop first. So, before you can walk, you're learning to sit up, then you start walking and you're using your arms, and then obviously then it translates down to your hands. So they talk about proximal to distal, like shoulders down and from hips down, and your core strength is of course very, very important. So if you have a child that you see like laying on their desk a lot, and again, Andrea talked about fatigue, you may think like, oh, they're just tired, but they could just have a really weak core. And so if you don't have a strong core, and if your child is, and we see this a lot too, where kids aren't maybe sitting at that 90, 90, 90 angle, at your shoulders, hips, and knees, where their feet are supported on the floor. So think about that. If you're sitting all day and your feet aren't touching the floor and you have poor core strength, think about how exhausting that is. And you're constantly have to try to engage your core, having to think about sitting upright. You're not going to be learning as well. So if you see kids too who have like weak hand strength, that could be, an indicator too that again, maybe their larger muscles are still weak. They haven't developed those intrinsic hand muscles that are really critical for coloring, cutting, writing, things of that nature. Then we need to work on core strength first and working on hand strength, working on even some of those large muscle groups. So lots of times you'll see those kids again being clumsy, fatiguing quickly, even with their hands, because those muscles aren't developed. There's arches in your hands, and they have to be able to oppose their fingers. And even with hand development, your grasps start more like in the ulnar side of your hand, and then they come down to that pincer grasp and a tripod grasp, which you should be using successfully to be able to write. So those are things you want to be looking for. Like I said, seeing a kid laying their head down a lot, not being able to sit up, not being able to pay attention, and weak hands. If you see a child who can't grade pressure, they're writing very lightly or very heavily, that again could be a sign of some fine motor delays and difficulties with their hands. And even sensory processing at that too. So those are some things that you want to look out for when you're seeing here with kids in the classroom to be aware of.
So you have shared such great information, and I think that sometimes we don't realize what a valuable resource our OTs are within the building because classroom teachers are oftentimes just in their room and plugging along, trying to get everything done. So again, during MTSS, we talk about tier one meeting and problem solving and who should be at the table whenever we're looking at all of our students. And we often say we need to invite our occupational therapists, our physical therapists, our speech and language pathologists.
Whoop, whoop.
And we know that that's not always happening. So how can we bridge our relationships? Like, what are some things that you can do with teachers to collaborate to create that truly inclusive learning environment in that tier one environment in the classroom?
That's a great question. Right now, whenever I'm in a school district and if a teacher has some difficulties with either one or multiple children in the classroom, some ways that we've been handling it in some districts is I go in with a tool for them to go down through a list and tell me what concerns they're seeing. And, with a specific student or a couple students in that class. And oftentimes, they might have one or two specific students in mind, but they'll say, there's other kids that are struggling with this too.
Yeah.
So I will take a look at that checklist. And what I'll do is I will write down strategies for them to try in the classroom and to help not only that student, but everybody. And I'll provide them with any materials that they may need in order to, implement those as well. Like, for instance, it could be, if some kids are having difficulty with cutting in the classrooms, I may give them some adaptive scissors to be trying. If they're talking about kids having attention issues in the classroom, I may give them, for some students, to tie along the bottom of their chair in the classroom, some TheraBands so that they're able to still sit in their seat and get some sensory input and movement in there, or a cushion, a move and sit cushion to use. There's other, I might give them some pencil grips or tell them about using some different programs like Handwriting Without Tears or some pencil grips to help them learn how to hold a pencil correctly, and even using broken crayons to help promote proper pencil grasp because they can't fist a full or a broken crayon. They have to use a tripod grasp on there. Although I have seen some kids still use some funky grasps on even a broken crayon. They're
Creative little ones, aren't they?
yes, but it still does improve. But anyway, yeah, so there's things like that we can do to help them learn about some of that development and just look at some just simple strategies to help all the kids in the classroom. And again, it's just including those kids in that same environment. And I think the teachers are learning right along with the kids. And I think seeing those other kids, observing those children, maybe using something a little bit different in the classroom, but still seeing that they can still do the same work with some of those accommodations or adaptations or different strategies is very important, again, for all the kids to see and maybe not be so afraid to ask for help if they need it or feel awkward about doing something a little bit differently. And I think that teacher OT collaboration is very important, because once they've seen some of these strategies help some of their students, they're always coming back for more, hey,
Mhm.
what about this kid? Now I'm seeing this. And then I think it really starts to stimulate the teacher's brain into thinking in a different way also. And I've seen a lot of them come up to me and say, hey, Cindy, what about this?
Mm.
This kid was like another student we had together. What do you think about me trying this? And it's just so nice to see them thinking in a different way about how to approach their students. And I think that they're becoming a lot more aware of that.
Mm.
But I always still think it's still important to talk with your OT and collaborate, just to make sure they're not missing anything, that, again, we're providing the best learning experience that we can with the student. And
Sounds
then I
like,
keep checking in with them.
Mhm.
Every week when I'm in that building, I stop in. How's it going? And they might tell me, oh, this is working great, but this isn't. Then we modify and we try something different. So it's just that constant communication and problem solving together, that they know their students better than I do, and I
Mhm.
can help bring those strategies in. And that's really, really important. I think that collaboration really helps for success.
yeah, and that's a perfect answer. That
Mhm.
collaboration, problem solving, and then we hear you say, then the teachers start thinking differently. It sounds
Mhm.
like removing those barriers, right,
Yes.
Andrea? UDL.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So with that, are there any resources that you're like 100% I would love to share with everybody listening to this podcast that you would want them to learn about, maybe supporting diverse motor skills or sensory needs, or anything in your OT world that would help people who are listening today?
Well, there is a lot on the internet today. I don't have any specific websites or anything, but I think a really big one is for teachers to really start to learn more about the sensory processing, the sensory integration,
Mm.
because that really, I think, um, not that it solves everything, but I think it really gives the teachers a better understanding of why they're seeing some of the things that they're seeing, the behaviors and the actions of some of the students that they're
Mhm.
seeing in their classrooms. And there's even been a more recent one, and it's called interoception,
Mm.
that is a new sensory integration system that's been more prominent lately and being talked about in the OT world. And that's just allows us to perceive our internal body sensations, such as hunger and thirst and pain. And as we all know today, there's a lot of kids that some of those basic needs aren't even being met.
Mhm.
And knowing that, you know, all of us feel that differently, I thought was pretty very interesting and stuff for me to learn about. Like thinking what might feel like hunger in my stomach may feel differently to another child, and if a child hasn't eaten that morning and they're reacting in a different way and or behaving in a certain way, and them not even realizing that they're hungry, it's just really makes sense to know why these kids again are behaving maybe the way they're behaving, because we all perceive things differently within our bodies internally. But I just feel that sensory is probably one of your bigger ones, for people to explore and learn and understand that a little bit better.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, Cindy, because that is something too that we focus on. We have a couple links that we've been using, some resources that we can link in our show notes.
Mhm.
But interoception, is also really then big with our students with autism, because
Yes.
sometimes they don't have that communication or
Mhm.
those language skills. And I mean, this is, you think about a typically developing 1-year old who doesn't have those
Yes.
language skills, but they're feeling things, right? And then
Mhm.
they're able to communicate that in a certain way. But being able to really address that ability to know why you feel a certain way and then communicate and act on that in a way that maybe isn't seen as a negative behavior, I
Yes.
think is huge. So we can link to a couple of resources on that. But yeah, absolutely, I think that is a super important way, to think about things. A lot of times, that's the first suggestion I give to some of the consults that I see. Is like, have we talked to the occupational therapist and done a sensory processing profile?
Absolutely.
Because
Mhm.
there are over responders and under responders, and that's not my expertise, but that is your occupational therapist expertise, and we appreciate the ability to highlight that today.
Absolutely. And any of that information that the teacher sees throughout the day. I mean, as an OT, I'm only seeing a snapshot of their day.
Mm.
So what any information they can provide for that I can help to provide strategies or accommodations to is really critical to the student. And like you said, that can vary from morning to afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
And even the parents, I think that's critical to have them involved when it comes to sensory stuff and things that they're seeing sometimes at home or strategies that work for them at home. That team effort there is, to me, is very, very crucial.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, as we wrap up, is there a success story that you would be willing to share, or something that comes to mind that when a child is provided something that they need for motor or sensory, that they can end up thriving because they got the appropriate supports?
Absolutely. I have, two quick stories to share. Years ago, I had one student who was very, he was on the autism spectrum and had a really great family, and he had a lot of sensory needs and very, very smart. And he wasn't always able to communicate how he was feeling, just like we talked
Mm.
about before. But he was verbal. But I remember, that the parents came to me and were saying that, their child was having a lot of difficulty sleeping, and therefore it was causing a lot of, negative behaviors, and he was having difficulty attending and things in the preschool classroom. And so I talked with the parents and tried to give them some calming strategies and things like that to help them, thinking that would help calm his body, go into bed at night, and help him sleep. And so I gave them some strategies to try. I said, try these for like 2 weeks. We'll see how it goes. They talked again and they said, none of this was working. So then I thought, let's try something different. We tried him really ramping him up before he went to bed at night. And, so they were taking, swinging him. Dad
Mm.
was roughhousing with him, playing with him, and doing all these things that you think would maybe get him even more excitable that he wouldn't want to go to bed. But once they did this routine every night, they did all these very physical activities, all these sensory seeking things.
Mm.
And then finally, we saw where he was sleeping at night. So, of course, that made mom and dad happy. And
Mm.
it made this student happy because he was coming back into school then, feeling better, able to learn and enjoying school and participating and learning. And then as time went on, he was very bright, like I said. We were able to start teaching him to learn his own body as to what his sensory
Mm.
needs were. And then he was able to ask for what he needed or even provide that sensory needs, things to himself to help him get through that. And that was just a really great success story for
Mm.
me. And I know that he would carry him and his family carried that throughout his school age years. So that was one thing. And this one's a little bit more common that I often see with kids is I've seen children who have really been struggling with their handwriting and learning um, because they just, again, whether they have a learning disability and also motor dysfunction, sensory integration issues. And what I've seen it happen to a lot of these kids is their anxiety just gets out
Mm.
of control and they're starting to shut down and break down. And I was just talking to one of my school psychologists about this the other day, and we are starting to implement some things to help this student, decreasing some of his handwriting and again, making modifications, still working on improving his handwriting, but adding some of those accommodations that we talked to before. And we are starting to see his anxiety coming back down. He is a happier child
Mm.
and he is more willing to try new methods and doing things because he's seeing that he can participate in the classroom and not feeling like a failure.
Mm.
And that to me is the ultimate, you know, success story, that
Mhm.
this child is able to participate and feel good about himself. And, his friends can see him progressing again and wanting to help. And that's what life is all about. And I'm just really thrilled to see that happening with some of the kids that we're working with. And I think the teachers, once they see that positive impact too, they're grateful for any help that we've given. And they've been great team members to work with. And that's what it all takes, a big team effort.
Well, I don't think Brianna and I could have said that any better, Cindy. That just gets to the heart of what we do, and the heart of what we all want to see is success for all students.
Mhm.
Providing some of those supports that, yes, we've identified this one student, but when we think a little bit more broadly about that, and we can provide those supports in a tier one system, where all students are feeling a little bit of the benefit from those kind of accommodations or flexible pathways that we talked about. We just want to thank you so much, Cindy, for your time, your expertise, and your willingness to be such a great collaborative partner. We really absolutely appreciate that. And maybe we'll have some things next year on tap for some more sensory things, because I know that that's coming around often. So we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for being here. And until next time, thank you for listening to the Very Able podcast, where we explore learner variability to empower extraordinary.